Hey everyone. Now, I know you guys have an AC coming up for your first SAC, so Mr. Marlingham just asked me to put together a quick walkthrough for last year's AC text just to help with your preparation. A bit about me. My name's Neil. I graduated with a 99.95 ATAR and a raw 50 in English language. Now, I was fortunate enough to receive a 50 out of 50 in the AC section of the 2024 English exam, so I just want to show you guys what helped me get that score, so hopefully you can do well in your first SAC too. But enough about me. I'm not here to talk about myself. If you want a full list of qualification, you can check the description of this video. But let's dive straight in. Now, I just came back from overseas, so this is my first time looking at this text properly. I have heard about this text, but I haven't actually looked at the features just yet. So this is a good opportunity for you to see how I think in real time when I'm unpacking a text and when I'm analyzing features for the first time. But before I move on, I just want to do a quick overview of the basic skills you should try to get good at in order to do well in ACs. And the first thing I want to cover is something called predictive analysis. So, as the name sort of suggests, predictive analysis is sort of where you just read this blurb or this summary that VCAR gives you at the start of every text to try to predict the ideas and the features in a text. And this is probably one of the most important skills for ACs. Before I even look at the text, I want to very carefully read through this little paragraph that Vika has given us here. Well, why is that? Most of the best ideas in any AC text can actually be predicted using this summary or the background information that Vika or your teacher gives you. In fact, 90% of the top features in a text can actually be predicted through a good reading of this summary here or this background information here. So, for example, um, in a political text, you can expect that there's going to be some like instance of active voice being used. Why? It's because politicians want to take credit for their actions and portray themselves in a positive light. And this makes for a very good analysis. Or, for example, in an advertisement, you might expect, for example, imperatives, modal verbs, positive connotations, etc. These are things that you can predict, and they also make for very good analysis. But my point is, the best students don't react to text to find features, but rather they proactively predict those features, which means they find the best features and they find them 10 times faster than students who simply react to text. Another thing I want to go through is like the basic sort of principles behind analysis. So when it comes to analyzing, the whole point of analyzing a feature is getting from like meta language to your SLV or your broader social linguistic variable. So the basic principle, the basic structure that you want to follow is you want to go from meta language to this broad idea. How do you do that? Well, you want to introduce something called an immediate effect. Now, this effect is just the surface level immediate impact of using the example in the text. So, for example, in the case of jargon, you want to talk about how jargon lends an erudite tone. And that in turn can do things like, for example, establishing expertise or creating a formal register. A lot of students would just jump straight from jargon to the final link to the formal register, which is a bit incomplete. So if you ever get the feedback that your analysis is incomplete, it probably is due to the fact that you're missing out on this effect, this little bridge here that brings you from the male language to this broad idea. Another example is imperatives. So a student might say, uh, X, Y, Z uses the imperative, and that in turn links to something like cognitive function. And they won't really explain the effect. Well, the idea is you want to explain the effect, the immediate impact of using a feature. In this case, for example, the imperative delivers a call to action, or it actuates readers or actuates the audience or galvanizes the audience into action, which in turn facilitates the cognitive function. So it's all about this little bridge here, which is our effect. And one more thing. So when it comes to analysis, you want to always extrapolate on the ideas that are given in the text. So when you're analyzing, you don't want to restate what's obvious. It's all about extrapolation. It's all about going beyond what's in the text, going broader, bringing in your own ideas. And I'll show you how to do that when I go through this text with you. But if a teacher ever says your writing's very descriptive, that probably means you're not extrapolating, but rather just staying in the obvious and describing what's actually in the text rather than bringing in your own ideas. As you extrapolate more, as you bring in more of your own ideas, your analysis will start to get a lot better. And you'll see what I mean when I unpack the features in this text here. Now, before I go through this text, I do encourage you to have a go at doing it yourself. So maybe pause this video and have a go at writing an AC on this text or just try and find features for this text. That way you can learn a lot more instead of just me giving you the answers. Righty. So what I'll do now is I'll show you what I mean when I say predictive analysis. So I'm going to go through the background information given here. I'm going to try to pick up on the SLVs, the contextual factors that underpin this text. So let's have a look at this summary here. In the following transcript, Professor Kelvin Kong, a Warimi man, okay, so he's Indigenous Australian, which tells us about his cultural identity. So that's something we can talk about in cultural context. He's receiving the NAIDOC Person Award. Okay, so we know he's receiving the award here, and it's an acceptance speech. The ceremony in front of a live audience, predominantly made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and fellow award recipients. Okay, so that's our text type and situational context there as well. The NAIDOC Awards recognize outstanding contributions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples make to improve the lives of people in the communities and beyond and to promote their issues in the wider community. Okay. Kelvin Kong graduated from UNSW to become Australia's first Indigenous surgeon. Okay, that tells us a lot. So, coming from a medical background myself, I can say that surgery is probably the most competitive specialty. And the fact that Kelvin Kong here has gone all the way to become a surgeon, despite the obstacles that he might face as an Indigenous Australian, really gives us a lot of information about what he might be trying to convey to the audience. So he might be trying to motivate, inspire, or empower his community and show them that it is possible to make a difference. And it also tells us about the semantic field or the semantic domain. We know that it's going to revolve around medicine and possibly Indigenous health. So that's a really big issue in healthcare right now. So there's a lot to talk about there. He has received this award for his innovations in hearing health, particularly working with children. Okay, so he's a pediatric ear, nose, throat surgeon. Okay. His mother, Grace. Okay, so this is a bit of family history as well. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to predict what the contextual factors, what the broader ideas might be for this text, just based on what I've read here. Now, I know you guys might use something like Mrs. Fat CDs, but I'll just go through the ones I think are the most salient. So firstly, let's start with register. So as you guys know, register just means how formal, how informal the text is. And for this text, just based on what we've read here, it's hard to tell whether it's going to be formal or informal. It could really go either way. So it's best to assume that we're going to have a mixed register here, just to be safe. So there's going to be elements of both informality and formality as well. So starting off with informality, what we want to do is we want to think about what the reason is behind using the informality. So whenever you analyze register, it's always important to mention the underlying reason behind the register. So why they're being informal, why they're being formal. That's what's going to actually add depth to your analysis. So don't be generic and say something like the informal register helps build rapport. Make sure you're being nuanced with your analysis. So in this case, the informality allows them to like bond with his community. So you can say something like the informality, or in other words, the underlying conversational tone um, brings himself, so Kong, and his indigenous community closely in unison, right? Uh, and you can even link to tenor as well. You can say it, creates a closer tenor. So you can say something like it fortifying, his tenor with fellow Indigenous Australians in the audience. So that's how you want to analyze it. That's how you want to unpack it. Make sure you're always talking about the underlying reason for the register, not just saying like, this text is informal, because that's what everyone's going to do. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we also have formality. I think formality plays a really significant role in this text. Like that's what I'm going to assume here is because like what he's talking about, like, Indigenous health, which is a pretty serious issue, has a lot of weight and gravity. So accordingly, you want to use a formal register. So when you're talking about healthcare or like serious issues, you don't want to joke around. You don't want to like be casual about it. So you're going to use informality. Sorry, you're going to use formality to recognize the gravity or the emotional weight of the subject matter. So that's one reason for using a formal register, other than, of course, establishing expertise, authority, social distance, etc., the generic stuff. It can also discuss how using a formal register also allows him to distance himself from those who are sort of in a way against him. So you can say the formal register also allows him to distance himself or reinforce social distance um, from those who continue to you know, uh, to neglect what he's talking about. So you can talk about Indigenous health aid. So you can say distance himself from those who continue to neglect, systemic flaws or bias in the healthcare system. That's something you can predict based on the subject matter, based on um, like what we've read here. Now, moving on, let's move on to function. I think that's the next simplest thing after register. So in terms of function, we know that there's six function that VCA wants us to know. For in my opinion, I think the most salient one is likely going to be an emotive function. So the reason for that is because it's a acceptance speech. You're going to expect a lot of emotions sort of coming into play in the background. So there's going to be quite a few emotions at play here. So for example, he's going to express gratitude for receiving the award, and also he's going to express gratitude to those who have supported him in his journey and those who make efforts to improve the issue of Indigenous health. So I think it's going to be pretty multifaceted. So one of the ideas you can talk about here is gratitude. But on top of that, you can also discuss how he's going to be disappointed or disappointment or frustration uh, regarding the issues that face his community when it comes to healthcare. So he's not gonna ignore it or let it slide. He's gonna be showing some sort of disappointment or frustration regarding this as well. This is what I'm predicting here. Um, Now most students would stop there. So most students think that emotive function is just about expressing emotions. But here's the thing. If you switch your perspective, then you can actually like unlock one more way to analyze emotive function here. And the key to doing that is recognizing that emotive function isn't just about expressing emotions, but it's also about evoking emotions as well. So he's also trying to evoke certain emotions in the audience here. And in this case, he might be trying to um, evoke or ignite a sense of optimism in his audience or hope. So that could be one element of the emotive function. So you could also be trying to ignite a sense of hope or optimism. So sort of uh, providing a positive or an optimistic outlook on Indigenous health. Now, other than emotive function, another salient one would probably be referential. So referential function, as you guys know, is all about informing. Now, in this case, what's he going to be informing people about? Well, it's probably going to be about um, the issue of Indigenous health, right? So because he's a surgeon, because he's received this award for his innovations in hearing health, he's going to talk about the issues that that plague Indigenous health that affect Indigenous Australians when it comes to healthcare. So it'll probably have some role in educating the audience. So you can say the referential function is to educate the broader Australian audience um, on, about the systemic marginalization and discrimination, or not discrimination, but lack of access to healthcare, faced by Indigenous communities. So I want you to notice the verb I've used here. So instead of saying inform, which everyone's going to say, I've tried to be a bit more nuanced here, and I said educate. So that's what you want to do when it comes to function. You always want to be a bit nuanced with how you describe it. So instead of just saying, you know, inform people about X, Y, Z, you use verbs like educate, apprise, update, etc. They'll add more nuance and detail to your analysis. Um, Lastly, I think a cognitive function will also work here. Yeah. So as you guys know, cognitive function is basically where you get people to do something. In this case, what might Kelvin Kong be trying to do here? Well, he could be trying to get support from Australians, right? He wants people to support him in his efforts to improve healthcare for Indigenous Australians. So you can sort of word it like this. So it's garner or canvas support from Australians to improve Indigenous healthcare or make inroads to Indigenous healthcare. So make inroads just means like make progress and like improve something. Um, yeah, I think that's pretty good for function. Let's move on to something else. So what else do we have? We're going to talk about purpose and intent. So let's talk about purpose and intent. So in terms of purpose and intent, if you ever stuck, if you ever want ideas, I suggest going to the study design and look at the dot points provided for Unit 3. So they'll give you a bunch of purposes and intents in the study design. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a good starting point if you're stuck. So, like one of the dot points, it's like one of the purposes in the study design that's listed in the dot points of the study design is social harmony. So how you might be trying to promote social harmony, right? And also negotiate social taboos, right? In this case, like surrounding, um, like the marginalization, right? And yeah, like the marginalization of Indigenous communities, right? When it comes to seeking healthcare. It can even be trying to challenge these social taboos as well, right? Or confront these social taboos. So that's one purpose you can discuss there. So it's from the study design. Another thing from the study design that you can throw in is building solidarity. So you might be trying to like engender solidarity here or build solidarity. And solidarity basically just means uniting people through common ground. So some sort of shared goal or shared background. Um, so in this case, it would be to unite the Indigenous community, through a shared uh, vision or goal or resolve um, of improving healthcare, right? Healthcare outcomes. Yeah, health outcomes for Indigenous Australians. Yeah. Um, so I'd say that's pretty good in terms of purpose. But the thing is, like most shifts will stop there. And the difference between like a 40 plus and a 50 is that the 50 student thinks outside the box. They think creatively. They think deeply about what the author or the speaker is trying to do. And often that isn't encapsulated in these generic purposes from the study design. So what they do is they think of a more engaging, a more specific, more creative purpose instead of just using something from a study design. So if you want to think outside the box, if you want to think about what Kelvin Cole might be trying to do here, you might come across the idea that outside of promoting social harmony and genuine solidarity, he would also be trying to empower people, like I mentioned earlier. So another purpose or intent they can talk about, a more creative one, a more engaging one, is he's trying to empower like Indigenous Australians, his community, right? Um, like who are like forced, to endure like all the like suffering in a way, like all the systemic bias, right? Um, or ineffective treatment that is caused by um, like the flaws in the system, the healthcare system. So he's trying to empower these people. So he's trying to give them hope. That's the nice intent they can talk about, a nice purpose. Um, Another thing you can discuss is how you try to sort of like raise awareness of like the issues that face like Indigenous health. So uh, you can say he's trying to raise awareness, or if you want to be a bit more fancy, you can say he's trying to expose or efforts, you know, uh, the unfair treatments of Indigenous Australians. unfair treatment Indigenous Australians face in seeking professional health treatment. Now, if you want, I think it should be possible to combine some of these purposes and sort of like put them all into like one. So if you want to combine them, you can say something like, you know, the text serves a dual purpose of both, you know, solidarity and also like exposing the unfair treatment and the marginalization that's happening in the healthcare system. So you can say, yeah, it serves a dual purpose of both solidarity and indictment. That's a good word. Yeah. And you can expand on that a bit. So you can say, on one hand, the solidarity, but you can say uniting Indigenous Australians, you know, through a shared goal or shared result of improving healthcare. Whilst on the other hand, the indictment part, you want to also talk about that. So uh, you can say like whilst exposing the systemic marginalization faced by the community. So that's how you can word it if you want to like combine some of the purposes together. Yeah, I think that's pretty good for purpose and intent. What have I missed? Okay, so we can also go through cultural context as well. So we can also try to predict some elements of that. Now, I have a bit of an advantage here because I'm studying medicine and I'm learning about this stuff. But when it comes to Indigenous health, there are a lot of stereotypes that affect the way Indigenous people are treated. So, for example, a common perception is that Indigenous people, they cause their own, illnesses or poor health. But the truth is, it's actually due to systemic issues, systemic flaws, right? That mean the system is actually able to accommodate for the needs of Indigenous communities. So what Calvin Cole might be trying to do here is he might be trying to dispel certain stereotypes. I'm trying to dispel stereotypes that frame Indigenous Australians, Indigenous communities as like being responsible for their own suffering, or I won't say suffering, um, for their own bad or like poor health outcomes. You can even say pathologize. That's a nice word as well. Yeah. So yeah, cultural context is all about like views, values, beliefs, attitudes, stereotypes, identity, basically the broader like societal level stuff. So you can also talk about Kong's indigenous cultural identity. Indigenous cultural identity. So yeah, it was stated earlier that he's a Wormy man, so that's part of his identity, his cultural identity. And you can expand on that by talking about the values that underpin that identity. So, for example, like this identity is grounded in values of like kinship, community, etc. So that's what you can talk about for cultural context for this text. Um, we'll go through audience now. So, in terms of audience, so it's important not to be generic with the audience. So if you just said like the audience is this live audience in a ceremony, and then it wouldn't be that great. It would be pretty generic. So what you want to do is you want to add a bit of depth and nuance to your analysis and sort of split the audience into two. And we call this the primary and secondary audiences. So the primary audience is like the immediate direct audience of the text. So in this case, it's going to be the live audience at the ceremony. And this live audience is made up of Indigenous people and fellow award recipients. So yeah, that's going to be your direct, like live, immediate audience. So a live NAIDOC ceremony audience. And this is linked to like stuff like unity, solidarity, which is trying to form with his community. Now, the secondary audience is the broader audience. So it would be the wider Australian public. So, for example, It could be, for example, like non-Indigenous Australians. Could be policymakers, um, health institutions, like hospitals, etc. I mean, it's a non-exhaustive list, but that's the idea. It's a broader, wider audience, if that kind of makes sense. Now, the audience is a target of your function, purpose, and intent. So that's how you want to incorporate it into your analysis. Um, Now, situational context should be pretty obvious. So I don't want to dwell on that too much. So you've got the setting being a award ceremony. You've got the semantic domain, the semantic field of healthcare. You've got the spoken mode, etc. So that's pretty straightforward. But hopefully you can see that we've gotten so much purely using the background information given by Vika. So it's pretty amazing how much you can do if you just think analytically and make the most of what you're given. So what I'll do now is I'll move on to the text itself and have a go at finding features. Okay, so let me just read through this text. Now, before I actually start finding features, I'm going to read the text and split it into sections so I know what each section is talking about and I can refer back to it when necessary. This helps you form a sort of map of the text in your head. So that's what you want to do whenever you're reading any text, always split it into sections first. Now, let me have a go at doing that for this text. Banana queen, okay. Okay, so there's a few formalities here. Um, okay, so he's acknowledging people have also made an effort in this space. Okay, so we can link that to positive face needs. Um, okay, now he's talking about hearing health. Two-edged sword. Okay, that's interesting. It's a metaphor. Okay, so we have one side of the sword here is happy, overjoyed. Okay, right. Okay, so two-edged sword is live in a country, resetting civil war background. Okay, now he's talking about um the sort of negative aspect of Indigenous health. So there's contrast here, there's juxtaposition here. So you notice that when he's going from one edge of this sword to the another, like to like another end, another edge, sorry, he's switching the lexis that he's using. So he's going from using words like happy and overjoyed to, um, appalling, sad, etc., ashamed, bad. So there's a bit of antinomy going on here, which is a very good feature to analyze. Um, okay, happy successes. Okay, so he's talking about like success stories, I'm pretty sure. So, okay, so one of his patients. Okay, so now he's giving us some like real life stories of his patients. Interesting. So that can be analyzed as well. Okay, our culture, our songs, and singing. Okay, this is a good example of parallelism. People can definitely analyze that. Um, okay, so paying respect to elders here. Okay, that's something you can analyze as part of cultural context, proper noun elders. Okay, and then he's finishing off the speech there. Okay, so now I have a general idea of how this speech is structured, what each section is about. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a look at each section in more detail, and I'm going to try to find features for each section, try to unpack them too. So let's go back to the start. No, I don't think there are many features that popped out here. Obviously, you can analyze some openings, formulaic utterances, etc., but not too high yield. So I'm going to move on to some features that I think might be more interesting. So to decide which features, where to find the good features, I'm going to go to the sections that I think are the most salient in this text. And one section that really stood out to me was the part where it was talking about the two-edged sword. So I'm going to go to that section there. Okay, so hearing health is just so important. It's a two-edged sword. Okay, so this is definitely an example in itself. This is a metaphor. So I can definitely analyze that. So happy and overjoyed to be in the room full of such amazing people. Um, okay, the two-edged sword is that we live in a country, and I'm setting this award on the background of appalling e-health statistics. Okay, so there's a lot of negative language here. Right? There's a lot of negative connotations here, and we could definitely analyze that. So let me take a close look at this. Okay. it's sad that we have to celebrate how bad our kids' ears are. Now that stands out to me. And for me, I think this would be a great example of irony. So we can label it as a declarative, right? It's sad that we have to celebrate how bad our kids' ears are, but in essence, it's an example of irony because what he's doing here is he's sort of pointing out how we're, like turning something that's negative into like a positive occasion, right? So you're celebrating uh basically a failure of the healthcare system. And any form of contradiction is something we can like label using the male language term irony. So irony isn't just things like sarcasm. You can also analyze like any form of like contradiction that's surprising or even humorous to some extent. So what I'd do in this case is I would actually combine um, the metaphor and the example of irony here because they sort of like together fulfill the same overall motive. And in terms of how to actually explain it, so I'd first combine those features, say, okay, the metaphor, uh, two-edged sword, uh, which is line 17 and also I think, yeah, line 27. And the irony embedded in the declarative, uh, we have to celebrate how bad our kids are. Okay. Um, so I'll just shorten that. Okay. Um, so in terms of what they do, how you can elaborate is you can say that you're sort of like using the ceremony, this award ceremony, as an opportunity to expose all the things that are going wrong with the healthcare system. So you can say it weaponizes the ceremony itself as like as a receipt or as proof of like the systemic sort of issues, like systemic neglect um, targeted at like indigenous communities or indigenous, yeah, indigenous communities, yeah. Um, and that can be linked to like the intent or the purpose of exposing all the things that are wrong with the healthcare system as I elaborated above. So that would be a pretty good feature there. Um, oh yeah, another thing that stood out in this section for me was the antonymy. So if you scroll up to the first edge of the sword, so this section here, he's using words like happy and overjoyed, amazing, etc. But then on the other hand, in this second edge of the sword, he's using like negative language, like appalling, ashamed, bad, sad, etc. So there's a clear shift in the language he's using. There's a clear shift in the tone that he's using when describing these opposite ends, these opposite edges of the sword. Now, the best way to analyze this, the best male language term, in my opinion, uh, to analyze this would be antonymy. So I'll just use that as my male language term here. Let me just I'll just quote this. Uh, so on one hand, he's using like um, like for example, happy and overjoyed here, in line 19, right? And then he's contrasting that with words like appalling and ashamed here in lines 31 and 35, and also sad and bad here. So um, we also want to quote those shame, sad, bad, appalling, etc. Don't have to quote all of them, but um, just if you want to, you can quote as many as you want. So whatever line number those are. Now, in terms of how to analyze this, so firstly, what I'll do is I will talk about how like using the antonomy here creates these two distinct sides to the issue, or these two distinct perspectives. So on one hand, you're celebrating the occasion and the award, and on the other hand, you're sort of like looking into like the reality of Indigenous healthcare. And I would analyze it by saying that it constructs like two distinct emotional poles. Um, so on one hand, you have like joy and celebration, right? Which is like juxtaposed by, or which is converted or transformed, or you can say tempered by, um, like the other end of the spectrum, which is like, despair or like moral discomfort. So that's like the immediate effect there of using that feature. Now, in terms of what I link it to, I think the best thing to link this to would be uh, negotiating social taboos. Because what he's doing here is he's confronting, um, he wants to confront the social taboo, you of like systemic, marginalization, right, of indigenous communities in the healthcare system. So people like, coming from a medical background myself, people sort of put their head in the sand when it comes to like analyzing, sorry, when it comes to sorry, that was my alarm. Yeah, so people sort of put their head in the sand when it comes to like indigenous health, and they sort of ignore the issues that happen in the healthcare system, the sort of systemic flaws that make it harder for indigenous people to seek healthcare. And what he's doing here is he's confronting that social taboo, getting people to actually like, wake up to this issue of like, indigenous health. Right? So I think the best thing to link it to would be purpose. And that would be negotiating or confronting the social taboo of like the systemic marginalization, etc. Okay. Now moving on, I'd say for this section here, there's not much more I can talk about. Let's move on to the next section. But I don't want to draw some of the horrible statistics. Okay, so we have um a coordinate conjunction here. Now, this might seem pretty insignificant, but the thing is, you can actually link it to topic management. So what he's doing here, by using a coordinate conjunction, but right, as you know, it's part of fanboys for a nor but or yet so. He's using a coordinate conjunction to shift the topic, you know, um, from all these negative things about the healthcare system to what he's going to talk about in this section, which is the success stories, his happy successes that he's had with his patients. So that's a pretty significant feature when it comes to topic management. So you can analyze it as a topic shift. Okay, so let's move on to this next section here. Horrible statistics. Okay, we have another example of anatomy here. So horrible statistics and happy successes. Now, if you don't want to say antonymy, I know like you're not meant to repeat male language in ACs. So if you don't want to say antonymy, you can just say like juxtaposition of noun phrases. Um, horrible statistics and happy successes. Now, um, in terms of how I'd analyze it, so he's going from something negative to, like these positive success stories. So you can say like it introduces an optimistic turn to the speech or an optimistic twist to the speech, which, links to how he's like showing Australians, right? Um, like that it's possible to make a difference, right? That it is possible to make a difference or an impact through healthcare. So as a doctor, he's showing everyone that, okay, we can fix this issue, we can make it better. And in terms of what you can link it to, you can link it to the idea of hope, as we mentioned earlier. So he's trying to inspire or ignite or kindle hope, in Indigenous communities. And also, you can also link it to the idea of empowering people who are affected by, like these things that are going on in the healthcare system. So empower those affected by systemic flaws in the healthcare system. And that's like, purpose/intent. So that's a pretty good feature there. Okay, let's move on. Apologizing first. Okay, dob in. So the phrase dob in is actually a colloquialism. You can be more specific and call it a colloquial verb phrase. And this can be linked to informality. So that really stood out to me because it's an informal language feature. So you can say that, like, for example, it adds like a conversational tone to the speech, or it injects like light-hearted banter um, into the monologue, into the speech, and it also like whilst lending or creating a conversational tone, whilst lending a mellow and unpretentious tone. That's a phrase I like to use a lot. Um, and that in turn creates an informality. So it eases the atmosphere and you know heightens or augments the informality. So that's a pretty good feature. Okay, so now he's actually giving us like the success stories of like his patients. So um Shazaya, one of my patients, is almost in sixth class, so talking about operation, my boyfriend. Okay. Yeah, and we have Trevor as well. Okay, so what you can analyze here, I'd say like the best male language here would be the proper nouns. Proper nouns. Shazaya and um Trevor. So why is he using proper nouns here? Why is he giving like specific examples of his patients? Well, the idea is he wants to like give the audience like real success stories, like actual examples of patients' lives being transformed due to like good, effective healthcare. So uh in terms of how you can phrase it, you can say it like, by providing uh real success stories or like tangible examples. What he's doing here is he's making the impact of healthcare more concrete, right? So he's concretizes the impacts, of good healthcare, of effective healthcare, um, on like indigenous people or communities. And that in turn can once again be linked to the idea of like, igniting or kindling hope, empowering, etc., whatever you want to link it to. But it's a good feature though. Okay, let's move on. So there's a bit of laughter here, lots of prosodics going on. On a general note, like I've noticed that this text has quite a few, oops, has quite a few non-fluency features or features that reflect spontaneity. So you can talk about how the non-fluency features, such as, for example, like the pause here, right? Uh, this is one example. They reflect uh, like the raw, unfiltered, right? Um, unplanned or authentic, right? Nature of his utterances. And that makes him like more appear more genuine. Okay, so let's keep moving on. Another thing I'm noticing, um, yeah, another thing I'm noticing here is the words that he's using is a bit like they're a bit like elevated in a way. So if you look at confided and partake here, they're not words you'd use in like everyday casual speech. So they're slightly elevated. So we call it slightly elevated lexis, right? Like partake, um, and confided. So it's not proper elevated lexis, but it's slightly elevated. It's a bit more elevated than what you use in like casual everyday speech. And this is a feature of formality. can link it to the formal register. Now, why is he doing this? Well, this is pretty interesting. Think about what he's talking about here. He's talking about like real patients who've had their lives like transformed, through healthcare. This is a serious thing. It's not something that you joke about. It's the subject matter itself has a lot of gravity and weight. So in order to align with that, he's using a formal register, and that's done through using slightly elevated lexis. Um, yeah, in terms of how I can explain that, I would say like for example, it instills a sense of seriousness or solemnity. Solemnity. Uh, or you can even say credence. Credence, yeah. Which in turn hardens the formality of the formal register. Okay, let's move on. Oh, this is really good. Okay, so this is what I identified earlier when I was like splitting the text into sections. This here is an example of parallelism. Now that is a valid male language term for this example, but if you want to be more specific, you can call it a parallel tricolon. That's the more specific male language term. This is out of the study design, but like if you want to stand out, it's a good idea. So yeah, the parallel tricolon, our culture, our songs, our singing. Well, what does it do? Well, I find this feature pretty interesting because what he's basically doing here, right, is he's sort of implying that the effects of healthcare, like go beyond just like physical health. They transcend like physical health, right? But they also affect like culture and society as well. So, in terms of how you can analyze it, you can say like, firstly, like what parallelism does has like a accumulative effect. That's the immediate effect of parallelism. But in terms of what you link it to, um, you can talk about how like it implies that improving healthcare or improving like health or ear health in this case, if you want to be more specific to the text, uh, is not merely like clinical success, right? It's not like it just affects physical health. It also affects other elements of your life, right? So it repositions healthcare as cultural continuity, right? Uh, it portrays healthcare as something that can not only improve the physical health of Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, but it also helps preserve their culture. It helps them maintain cultural continuity. That's something we learn about in medicine. So I do have a bit of an advantage here, but that's the idea. And I in turn can be linked to cognitive function. Why is that? It's because they're trying to get people to like support efforts to improve healthcare for Indigenous people. Okay, and let's move on to the next section, or like the final section of the text. This is so wonderful. Oh, elders, yeah, this is another good example. So, um, elders is a proper noun which is used in indigenous culture to refer to people who sort of like lead the community, not just people who are like old, but people who like lead the community. They're like seniors, right? And uh, in terms of how you can analyze it, I'd say the best thing to link this to would be cultural context. So it's a cornerstone of indigenous culture, right? And it preserves like cultural heritage. And that can be linked to cultural context. Say like it's part of his cultural identity as a what was it? As a Warrini man. So um, that's how you want to analyze it. But yeah, I think the rest of it's pretty straightforward. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how to approach the text if I was to do it in the exam. And I hope you took something away from my thought process when I'm going through a text for the first time. So yeah, hopefully you guys do well in your first sack, and most importantly, have fun. And also usually gives very interesting texts every year for their sacks, so I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun. Go and make Mr. Marlingham proud.